Okay, so it's time for chapter 2 now. Hopefully, you guys have all finished chapter 1 because it was due on Sunday, so hopefully, you turned that in. Um, you should have finished your introduction little snippet with the political compass quiz. If you haven't done it yet, email it to me. I will still take it up until the end of this week, and then you won't get a grade for it after that. Um, I know there was about 6 or so that wasn't able to complete it, but email it to me as soon as possible. Most of you guys got your quiz done, which is good. If you weren't able to access the quiz, email me as well. I know a couple of students that weren't finished enrolling yet, so get that taken care of and you can take the quiz whenever you're actually enrolled. So before we get started, in this class we're going to discuss a lot of current events. These current events will be on your exams. I will take a somewhat easy question from these current events that we talk about in class, and they will be on your exams just like any other material. First of which is these are going to be a lot of international incidents. We're not strictly going to talk about American politics when we're talking current events. We've stuck to American politics in this class. We'll be talking about impeachment for the next 2 months in the election. We will talk about impeachment, we'll talk about the elections, but if we talk about the same things that go on in American politics, we're all going to want to jump off a bridge. So we're going to expand and talk about world politics, because the globe is shrinking and world politics impacts American politics and vice versa. So it's important for you guys to know what's going on in the rest of the world. The first thing we're going to talk about is the Australian wildfires. I've included 2 videos here. Since we can't have direct discussions, considering I'm talking to a camera, not a classroom, I'm not going to show the videos in this video, but I do expect you guys to watch these yourselves, have a discussion in class if need be. If the instructors want to pause this video now and open these up, you're more than welcome to. The first clip is from The Daily Show, and the second clip, I believe, is CBS News, discussing what's impacting Australia right now. Other things that we'll talk about later on in the course, Brexit, the date for the British to leave or to start the leaving process with the European Union is the 31st this week, and then they have 11 months to finalize a new trade deal after that. So we'll talk a lot about Brexit and the politics surrounding Brexit as well. Impeachment, mentioned this. We'll talk about Trump's impeachment. Right now, Trump's lawyers are setting their argument as I speak. Probably wait a little bit, maybe next week, talk about impeachment and see if there's been any movement. It doesn't currently look like Trump's going to be removed from office unless they're able to get massive evidence that gets Republicans to turn away from him. We'll talk about the Democratic primaries. Next Tuesday is the first Democratic primary in Iowa. And then the week after that is New Hampshire. And historically, if a candidate has won both Iowa and New Hampshire, they win the national primary. So these early primaries are vastly important, and we'll talk about the Democratic primaries. There is technically Republican primaries, but no one is going to beat Trump. No one's really running against him that has a chance of unseating him. So Trump's going to win the Democratic or the Republican primaries, which does lead to problems if he is removed from office. Discussion of if he can still be the candidate in 2020, or if then Republicans want to run Mike Pence or someone else in the place. I mean, this kind of discussion is very abstract because it's probably not going to happen, but it's something fun to talk about when it comes to American politics. We'll talk about the Hong Kong protests. These have kind of died down in recent months, but for most of last semester, there were massive protests going on against Chinese interference in Hong Kong. We'll touch on that more in the semester as well. We'll touch on U.S.-Iranian relations. This hit a big boiling point during the Christmas break with Trump ordering the killing of a Iranian leader after Iranian-backed individuals graffitied, protested at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, which led to possible conflict between the U.S. and Iran. Iran then responded by sending missiles against U.S. military bases in Iraq. And now a lot of the soldiers at those military bases are experiencing brain damage from those attacks. So there could be continuing problems coming from this. We'll talk about the coronavirus. I think I have the coronavirus down for chapter 3. So in the next video, we'll talk about the coronavirus and what all that means right now. With the way it's going, we'll probably talk about it multiple times during the semester as it changes. But for the moment, we'll start with the foundation of the coronavirus and what's going on in Wuhan, China. We'll talk about Modi and Muslim rights in India. I don't know how many of you guys know about this, but there's been severe problems with legislation that Modi's backed about putting Muslims at the back of the line when it comes to immigration, stripping rights of citizens in Kashmir, and removing voting rights for Muslims in India in some places has led to mass protests in India. And India is the largest democracy in the world, so politics in India is very important. And then assuming 2020 Olympics come around, as they get closer, I think they will start until after the class is over, but we could see build up in politics, especially if we're looking at the coronavirus. We could see problems with it being in Tokyo and difficulties coming out of that. So, we'll start the lecture now. Before the Constitution in the United States, before even the Revolution in the colonies, most of our foundation of our laws comes from our British heritage, coming from the foundations with the English Parliament and the Magna Carta and other foundational legal doctrines that came from British politics is where we get the foundation for our democracy from. It always bugs me. You guys in your papers will talk about it if I ask you about this, talking about the impact of the king and wanting to get out from under a dictatorship in England. England was a democracy for the most part. The English Parliament had been increasing its influence at the time, and the king started having less and less influence. I mean, that was the big rallying cry for the colonists, was no taxation without representation. They wanted representation in Parliament, not to think that the British were strictly the king making all these decisions, but it was Parliament itself. All the colonial charters had very similar foundations that we would have later on as well. So there's this concept in British politics of right of Englishmen. You have a right of a trial by your peers, especially for white men, which led to our judicial structure as well. We had the repeal of the Stamp Act was a big turning point in American politics, this led to this drive against taxation and movement towards trying to get representation or organizing the colonies. Then we had the Townshend Act that replaced the Stamp Act. This included the taxes on tea, which led to the Boston Tea Party and other protests. We held the first Continental Congress in 1774. I'm getting way ahead of myself in the 1900s here. 1774. This is where we start to see movement towards the Declaration of Independence, calls for revolution in order to have equality and self-government, to instill these Enlightenment philosophies ourselves instead of just relying on the British. Much of this came from the philosophy of John Locke. We talked about him in Chapter 1. John Locke is the one who brought up the ideas of inalienable rights. This life, liberty, and property is what he discusses. These are now typically called human rights. And this idea of the social contract, that's the relationship between the people and the country, is a social contract that the government has to preserve certain rights for individuals. And the people vote in trustworthy people to uphold those agreements that we have. So in the Declaration of Independence, you probably see that Thomas Jefferson paraphrased Locke. He originally wanted to straight up plagiarize Locke and say life, liberty, and property. It was Benjamin Franklin who crossed out property and said pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal, and government is derived from the powers of those of the consent of the governed. All ideas from John Locke. So during the Revolutionary War, we had the Articles of Confederation, not our Constitution. And this wasn't even itself a constitution. A constitution is a fundamental law that defines how a government will legitimately operate. The Articles of Confederation is more of a binding agreement between the colonies to work together. Had very weak national government in of itself. It prohibited any national regulation on states' commerce, meaning that the government, the national government couldn't limit trade between colonies or regulate it. Also meant they couldn't tax as well because of this. So the national government was strictly relying on funds given to it by the states. And states retained all sovereignty, freedom, and independence. States could leave if they so chose, and they could make basically any decision they wanted. And any amendments to the articles were requiring unanimous consent of all 13 states. You can see how that wouldn't happen. So after the revolution and the articles are in power for a bit, the weakness of this national government is shown during Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is just Daniel Shay leads a bunch of farmers who don't like that their property is being foreclosed because they can't pay. And so Congress has to bring out General Washington and a bunch of other revolutionary veterans to go quell the rebellion. So this helped show how the country needed a stronger national government in order to maintain order in the colonies, or in the states now. So that Congress convened the convention for fixing the Articles of Confederation in Philadelphia. But delegates that were sent by the states, they didn't care about what the Congress said under the Articles. The Congress was weak in of itself. When they arrived, they attempted to fix the Articles, and then they said that it wasn't going to work and needed to start over from scratch. So they decided to completely come up with a new government to replace the articles. So they drafted a new limited and representative government that we see today, that allowed for a stronger central government to maintain some order. And just this concept today is radical. If Congress today called a committee to get together and write a report on changes that need to be made in the government, and that committee said, why don't we just make a new government and go around Congress's back and get the states to ratify the new government in itself, they would be charged with treason now. But because of the weakness of the national government at the time, this was necessary, the founders determined. So important events that happened, the Great Compromise. This is when you get the Virginia Plan, which called for a representation in the legislature being based strictly on state population size, thus giving greater power to larger states. And New Jersey calling for equal representation between the states. You then get the Great Compromise of having two different legislative bodies with both organizing principles. So you have the Senate that has equal representation, 2 members for every state, and you have the House, which is based on population. And so another big compromise at the convention was the 3/5 compromise. Congress agreed to not tax exports, only imports of trade, and would prohibit the trade of slaves by 1808. And it also passed the 3/5 compromise, which allowed for every slave to be counted as 3/5 of a non-slave when determining population for the House. This is one of the more ridiculous fights that they had at the convention. Northerners pointing out that Southerners want to treat slaves as people when it only benefits them, but not people that should be free. And claiming that if Southerners think that slaves are property and that their property should count as people, why can't Northerners count their chairs and their tables as property as well and count them equal to people? Was the argument. It was foundational argument that led off into the Civil War, of this drastic divide on how to treat slavery and the moral fight between the North and the South when it comes to treatment of fellow humans. No surprise, North was against counting slaves. The South wanted it to allow them to have more representation power. Ended up that the South got partial what they wanted for them all to be happy. So the delegates establish a ratification process. They would send the new constitution directly to the states, foregoing the National Congress, and it would have to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states in order for it to become law. Eventually all 13 states ratified it fairly quickly, in a couple of years. 2 years, I believe. This is where we start to see the formation of the first parties in the United States. The Anti-Federalists, these were those against the Constitution and wanted to fix the articles like Congress originally wanted. Their arguments still hold an echo in American politics today when it comes to wanting a weaker national government and stronger states' rights. Then you have the Federalists. These are the ones who wrote the Constitution for the most part and wanted a stronger central government. They were famous for the Federalist Papers, This is a series of essays that were written by Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and a few others. Wrote a couple. We're seeing during the impeachment now both sides pointing to Madison's Federalist Papers for their arguments as well. So the framers' goals is they wanted a government strong enough to meet its needs, but not too threatening to weaken the separate states. And they were afraid of the government encroaching on individual liberty. And the government had to be based on popular consent. A majority had to come to a consensus on what to do, instead of a ruling minority of elites. So they wanted a government to act decisively but not irresponsibly, needing a government who can act quickly and fix problems but not be destructive to individual states and individuals. A big concern was majority rule under the Constitution. There was a deep-seated fear of the majority and what the majority could do to minority rights. This is the big reason why we have the Bill of Rights, to protect the minority from the majority. So the biggest cornerstone in this is individual liberty needed to be protected for all. In the Constitution, it grants powers. These are powers that are guaranteed, usually by stating specific powers that the federal government has in the Constitution. There are a total of 17 powers listed in the Constitution in this way. And there are denial powers. These are expressly written powers that the federal government does not have against states or individuals. And they made the Constitution very difficult to amend. That is why we've only had 27 amendments in the nearly 300 years our country's been around. It was purposely made difficult to change because of this fear of majority rule. You need a super majority in order to change the Constitution, making it more difficult for 51% of the country to dictate everything to the 49%. So the idea of separation of powers comes from Montesquieu, dividing the branches instead of having one individual institution that controls everything. Madison's Federalist Number 10 is where a lot of this is structured from, of the power of overbearing majorities. So we get these idea of overlapping powers, where different branches of government have shared powers in certain areas. Congress writes legislation, but the President and the Supreme Court can overturn it. Executive powers are under the President, but he needs the budget agreed upon by the legislature, and the Supreme Court can overturn any executive decision. And then the courts can overturn legislation, but Congress can always rewrite laws to change it, or the President can reorganize the institutions to get around the courts. So the Bill of Rights, those are the first 10 amendments in the Constitution that were passed quickly after the ratification of the Constitution. These are the powers of rights to citizens that limit the federal government. This is where I try and get the class to answer and see how many of the amendments they can name. There's no one here to ask, so think in your head, how many of the amendments can you think off the top of your head? So first of which, we have the First Amendment. This is the easy amendment. Should get this: free speech, free press, free assembly, and prevention of the government from creating or favoring a religion. Basically preventing a state church like they had in England, the Church of England, that imposed its religious views on everyone else, allowing individuals to practice their religion as they see fit, and not having the government favor one denomination over another. The right to keep and bear arms, one of modern day's hotly contested amendments, and how to define it. We'll discuss more about that one later on in the semester. This was a very big deal to the states and the individuals at the time. It does not really have much need modern day, but quartering of soldiers, the British government would come in and force individuals to keep soldiers in their house at their own costs. So they had to give up food for their children to feed British soldiers that were staying in their homes against their will. You have protections against unreasonable search and seizure. We'll talk more about this one later on as well. Basically, for the most part, law enforcement individuals need some sort of search warrant or probable cause in order to search you. Double jeopardy. You can't be charged for the same crime twice. Just compensation. If you get your property taken away, the government is supposed to pay you for what it's worth. Self-incrimination. You don't have to speak if you are going to incriminate yourself. And due process. So everyone is given a trial at a reasonable rate. That's where habeas corpus comes in. Speedy and public trial, should have an impartial jury and have an attorney or a right to an attorney. You can waive your attorney privilege if you want to defend yourself. 7 extends right to a jury to civil cases at the federal level. No cruel and unusual punishment. This is one of the amendments that gets discussed a lot, of how to define cruel and unusual punishment. 9 is a very important amendment. Just because a right is not listed in the Constitution does not mean this limits your rights. So just because there's something in the Constitution that's not written doesn't mean the government has the ability to regulate it. 10 states the exact opposite. The federal government only has powers listed in the Constitution and the laws that have been passed after the Constitution. If there's a power not listed in the Constitution, the government cannot do anything with it. And these powers are given to the states if they're not listed. There's been a lot of movement away from the 10th Amendment, and we'll talk about a little bit about that in Chapter 3 more. So what happened in Mulberry versus Madison? You've probably heard the story before. Mulberry was appointed a low-level bureaucratic job under John Adams after he had lost to Jefferson in the 1800 election. 1800, because it's 1803. It doesn't matter, really. Anyway, he was given this position by Adams, but the letters were never sent out prior to Jefferson taking office. When Madison came in, Madison was elected the Secretary of State, and instead of sending out the letters, he threw them in the trash and didn't appoint Adams' representatives. This eventually went to the Supreme Court, where it was decided that the Supreme Court had the constitutional ability to decide if the other branches were acting within the Constitution. this is where this idea of judicial review comes from, that the Supreme Court can decide whether or not something is unconstitutional. That's a basic summary of unconstitutionality and judicial review. So, prior to our constitutional convention, there were deep concerns about unfettered democracies. If you look back at Greece and Rome back in the day, these democracies failed and were overturned with authoritarian regimes from within. This deep fear of the tyranny of the majority would happen. And a majority would come into power, completely change everything, and trample over the rights of the minority. That's why the framers wanted to make sure that people had a voice in government, that they were able to have some say, that their rights were very hard to overturn. That's why democracy to the framers was this majority rule, absolute power of the majority during the time. So the framers came up with the concept of the republic, limited power, and that you had rights guaranteed in the Constitution, and you had representation in place. Majority rule is limited in the government of a republic because of the institutions that it sets up. And so one of the ways that it is done is you have elected officials that come in that represent people indirectly instead of having the masses vote on everything. The only original popular elected branch was the House of Representatives. This was intended to respond to the majority more easily every 2 years. You had the Senate, who originally was elected by state legislatures and state governors. They had 6-year terms. When the progressives came in, they overturned this and had majority voted senators by states. And then you have the president, who is elected indirectly as well through the Electoral College every 4 years. And the representation in the Electoral College is the same to the representation in Congress, 2 senators and however many representatives each state has. So there were different waves of democracy in the United States after the original constitutional group came in. You have Jeffersonian democracy. This was a movement having government for all, not just elites, away from property owners strictly. You have Jacksonian democracy. This is a movement towards popular vote in the Electoral College, having the masses vote on how the elector should vote in the Electoral College instead of just sending people and having them vote how they choose. Members in the states would have an ability to vote on the decision of the state representatives. During the Progressives movement, you see primary elections and increasing power of the parties and electoral behavior. So you see party primaries deciding who the nominees are, which has a drastic impact on the representatives that are finally up in the general election. This is where you see direct election of senators, direct referendums in many states, and direct initiatives. This is a movement towards elected officials being delegates instead of voting how they see, having delegates, or having representatives that carry out the will of their voters and not voting how they see fit, was a big cornerstone of the progressive movement. So what we originally started with would be considered a constitutional democratic republic. So we have constitutional powers that come through elections and are exercised by law with due respect to the citizens. It's democratic in the sense that majority influence via elections, and it's a republic by the mix of institutions and attempting to moderate the power. Now we see it to be more of a representative government is how we would define the United States. So we have more frequent elections than any other democracy in the world. We are constantly having elections, especially when you look at local elections. In many countries, election day is not as prevalent as it is in American politics. We are one of the few, we are the only major country that relies on primary elections and having party elections before. This also has a lot to do with our legislative structure as well. And then we are less democratic than other major democracies because of our constitutional barriers. Other Western democracies are far more democratic in their structure than us. So the divided branches and staggered terms of office, each elected individual has a different constituency, except for the Sioux senators from the same state. Everyone else is answering to different people, making the democratic representation more difficult. So that's it for Chapter 2. Remember, Chapter 2 and 3 are due this week. So after you're finished with this and Chapter 2 quiz, move over and do Chapter 3 because they're both due by Sunday at midnight.